All right. Thank you very much for being here. It's a bit of a deja vu. I think three of us are back like just about 45 minutes later in the same place. And I think it's that time of the day when things move on to the realm of fantasy and speculation. I mean, people are here from different time zones, different kind of altitudes, and we start to see things. So I think we are very well placed for this foray into fantasy. And there's been a lot of talk of, I think, immigration, undocumented immigration. And I have to say, I feel like a bit of an undocumented immigrant on this panel because my qualification is that I don't write speculative fiction. I think neither as a novelist nor as a critic, I have kept my distance. So maybe I'm the objective kind of observer here. So I have a few questions for the panelists, but what I'll do before that is I'll just let them introduce themselves, talk briefly about their work, and maybe just to touch very briefly on what drew them to this genre. I mean, what makes somebody sort of abandon, the immanent and go towards some kind of transcendental reality. So maybe, why don't I start with you?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to say I'm really honored to have been invited to this festival. And I'm amazed at how well organized it is. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I write mysteries, police procedural mysteries, set in the Southwest. I'm the daughter of Tony Hillerman, who was one of the first people... Thank you. As you know, Tony was one of the first people to kind of, I guess, take the mystery genre to the edge by using crime solvers who were not white, male Americans with drinking problems. And after my father died in 2008, he and I had never talked about my continuing the series, but I realized I was missing my dad tremendously, but I also was missing his characters and missing those stories. So I think my background was journalism. I had written 7 nonfiction books, but I had never written a novel. So I kind of took my own, I guess my own creative imagination to the edge to think that I could actually write a mystery, or write a novel first of all, and then write a mystery. So my first book, Spider Woman's Daughter, came out in 2013 and was very well received. I was nervous because my dad had trained his fans very well, and I knew they had high expectations, but they welcomed my sort of a little more feminine twist on the characters, and my introducing a woman as the crime solver into this series. So I guess I live in Santa Fe. I'm married to the photographer Don Strell, who worked with me on many nonfiction books, who's here with me today. And I guess that's enough about me for now.
Hello, thank y'all for being here and letting us be here. I am Stephen Graham Jones. I live here in Boulder. I've got, I don't know, probably 23 or 25 books or something like that. I don't just do mystery. I love to do mystery. I think mystery is at the heart of everything, actually, and everything else is just built around it. But because you never know what's going to happen, and you have to lay clues, and the characters have insight and figure things out. So I think it's all mystery. As for going to the edge and beyond, I do write a lot of horror, science fiction, and fantasy as well. And as for my impulse to go into those spaces, I think that it's my duty as a writer to take the reader somewhere they haven't been, And so if I can take them to 2872 on Mars, then I'll have done a service, I think.
It says it is on. Okay, even though I have a red light, it's still on. Okay, good. So what was the impulse to write mysteries? I wrote nonfiction books before I started writing these mysteries. And that's what led me into the Arapaho world, because I wrote a history of the Arapaho people when they lived here in Colorado, and a biography of one of their great leaders. It's called Chief Left Hand. And that book took me 5 years to research. I was totally obsessed. I was obsessed. I had no idea. I was a writer, and I was writing for magazines and all, but I had no idea if I would ever be able to get this book published, and I didn't care. I mean, I cared in that I did want people to read it, but I would have written it anyway. If everybody had come to me, everybody in the world had said, you cannot get this book published, I would have written it. I was obsessed. I was obsessed with the story. I was obsessed with this man's life, and I wanted to tell that story. So in the 5 years that I spent researching it, I started going to the Wind River Reservation where the Arapahoes live now, many of them. And they are Colorado people. They lived here. They were right here, where we are right now. This was their homeland. The federal government, in its great wisdom, took these Colorado people and put them on a reservation in Wyoming with their traditional enemies, the Shoshones. And I have to say, God love them, you know, they've made it work somehow. Maybe not always, you know, the friendliest ways, but they've made it work. And so that's what took me to the Wind River Reservation. So I got to know the people. I spent a lot of time there. I made many, many wonderful friends who are friends today. And then I always loved mystery novels. And I had a writing teacher at some point in my career who said, write what you love to read. And I thought, what good advice, you know? I love to read histories. I love to read biographies, and I wrote them. And I love to read mystery novels. And what draws me to them, rather than, I've never thought of them as being at the edge. It seems to me, as Stephen said, a mystery is right at the center of everything. It's the center of our lives. Life is a mystery. And in fact, there have been times in my career when I've talked to my editor about a story idea that I had, and I thought, you know, what about writing about this or whatever? And my editor will say, oh, nobody would believe that. That would never happen. And then I whip out the newspaper article from which I clipped this idea, and I said, you know what? This happened. So in a way, mysteries, just because the crime of murder, which is what I write about, is so beyond. It's beyond. It's so incredible, so impossible to even imagine, taking the life of another human being. And I think just dealing with that is really put you at the edge. And so I have to come up in my books with motivation on why in God's name would anybody ever do this or be pushed to do this. And that's part of the fun of writing mysteries, but it does happen. It does happen. The wonderful thing about mysteries, I love them because they aren't a mystery, they're a puzzle. That's what and I always love to read them, and I always try to solve the puzzle before I get to the end, and then I think I'm smarter than the author. But then, when I'm writing one, I'm always trying to write it in such a way that you cannot solve the puzzle before you get to the end. So it's always kind of a game you play with your reader. I love the puzzle part, but I also love the fact that mysteries take you into different worlds. And you can learn a lot about these different worlds that you wouldn't have known about before. And I find that really interesting. So that's what drew me to mysteries. And as I say, they're kind of just the idea of taking a human life is you're already at the edge when you get to that.
Thank you so much. Well, mystery is at the center of everything. That could very well become the bumper sticker for this panel. And I want to just pause at that for a minute, because I often think of literature as kind of this endless dialectic, endless tension between the familiar and the alien. And when I teach, that's what I tell my students, that we look for both in literature. We want literature, we want empathy, we want to identify with the characters, we want to say, yes, I know this character, this is like my neighbor or that gossipy aunt I had, this is exactly. But we also want that shock of the alien. We also don't want it to be so familiar, that to be so banal that we don't know anything about it. On the other hand, I think if it's completely out of the whack, if we can't connect to it at all, then it doesn't quite work. So in many ways, literature and probably all art is walking this tightrope between the alien and the familiar. And when I think of speculative or mystery fiction, it seems to me that obviously there's some fiction which is more closer to the alien sort of part, and there's some fiction which is closer to the comfort. And when I think of speculative fiction, I tend to think that it's something that is closer on that end. So with that, I wanted to ask our panelists today that, where do you see yourself located on this kind of axis of the alien and the familiar? I mean, these are just my words. Feel free to any words that work with you. Because in some ways I feel like you kind of have to give the reader both. You can't just abandon one for the other completely. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and maybe Steve can get us started.
Yeah, I think that tightrope you're talking about, I do feel it when I read novels and when I write novels as well. And I think it has something to do with transgression. The reader wants to be able to do on the page what they can't do in real life. Like Margaret was talking about murder, and we can't do that really, but we can read about it, and possibly we can understand why somebody might do that. And I think that when you massage some of that transgression into your story, and the reader goes with you over that line into an alien space with a familiar character, then you've got them. You can go wherever you want. You've got them in your own space, and it's like you're a puppet master. Maybe you can be a kind puppet master or a mean puppet master, but it's so as for where I position myself, yeah, hopefully over the line. That's where I want to be, in the alien.
I think that tension comes through particularly when you're creating good villains, because in my experience, to have in books I've read and books that I try to write, to have a good villain, there has to be enough in that character that the reader can say, yeah, I can understand that. That could have been me. And then there has to be the sort of part that makes you gasp, where you think, no, I would not have done that. But you're already kind of hooked because the writer has brought you in with enough that's familiar that then when the alien comes, you can't easily back out of it. I know in my second book, Rock with Wings, I have this dog, and I thought, oh, a dog is a dog. And then as the story goes on, I realize, oh, there's something kind of creepy about this dog. And so there was one scene where I needed something dramatic to happen, and the dog shows up, and the dog is doing undog-like things. And I'm thinking, where did this come from? But I think I think all of us sort of live with that tension between the normal and the bizarre, and sometimes when you're writing, your imagination can just take it to the extra step.
I think just the very act of writing takes you into an alien space. I know when I sit down to work and I turn on my computer to start a new novel and I look at a blank page and I think, okay, I'm talking to my characters. They talk back to me, which is a good thing. And I say to them, well, what have you been up to since last I saw you? And then I go into this other world, this world that I've created, set on the Wind River Reservation in the middle of Wyoming, and I'm sitting in Boulder in my study, and I'm looking out at the Flatirons, but I'm really in Wyoming. I'm on the Wind River Reservation. I'm with the people who really exist. And my poor family, when I'm writing a book, they know that I'm into my alien space, then they're not there. So I think that very active writing is really moving into a magical space in a way. I had an interviewer one time say to me, it was a radio interview, and she actually had read my books, which is amazing when you go to get an interview by somebody who's actually read your book, knows what they're asking. And she said, I think that you channel these characters. And I thought about that a lot, and I thought, maybe that's how it feels, that they really exist. They exist, and they're telling me their story.
Yeah, like E.L. Doctorow, he says that when the writing is going well, it's like taking dictation from God, That's what it feels like.
That is, in other words, writing about what you're not or what you don't know. And I think, Margaret also mentions the important point of motivation. And that's something I wanted to bring up, that I think writing fiction is by itself inhabiting otherness. That is, if you're not going to write things that are purely autobiographical, even somebody else, it's somebody else. I mean, and these questions always plague us. And can a man write as a woman? Can a human being write as a dog? Can, you write as a person of a different race? And these are things we're doing all the time. And speculative fiction, of course, pushes this question to a whole different plane. That, and what happens? Because in a real sense, we only know ourselves. We really don't know how, somebody else really thinks. And this obviously becomes when, even books like Animal Farm, it's a book about animals, but of course it's an allegory, so it's nothing to do with how animals really think. It's really a kind of anthropomorphism imposed on animals. So is that what happens when you write speculative fiction? The motivations are really recognizably human? Because, I don't know how else you might know anything that's not human. And how do you work that out in your characters and motivations?
I think this guy just got passed down there. I think what you're talking about is the power of the imagination. The power of the imagination is just, it's just awesome. It's amazing that you can sit down and you can imagine things that never happened to you. But you can imagine what it would be like because you're connecting to what we all share as human beings. And you're connecting to that, to basic, universal values and principles and things that we all share and that we all long for. Love and hope and things like that. That's what you're connecting to. And so you start imagining. And imagination can take you into fabulous places. And you have to go with that. I've learned as a writer over the years to go with my imagination and not censor it and let me see where the imagination is going to take me. When I'm writing about a killer, I have to imagine that person. He's first of all, or she is, because I'm an equal opportunity employer of killers, first of all, a human being. And I always think that person had a mother. That person had, I hope, someone who loved that person. Now that person's a killer. But there is some way with the imagination to get into somebody else's mindset and thought. And so I think it's just the power of the writer's imagination that you have to work with.
Yeah, my novels would be really boring if I could only write about a 45-year-old Blackfeet dude who lives in Boulder, because I don't have a lot of adventures, really, There's not dead people showing up on the page one of every week that I have. So we have to be able to step out of our own shoes and write, definitely. And when we write, I think when we write as, Animal Farm or anything, or from a dog's point of view or anything, we are definitely basically saying that's a human. It's just shaped like a dog or something, of course, which is fun. You do it with robots too. You do it with aliens. You do it with all kinds of stuff. Back at the first of my career, this is about like 01 or 02, I guess. I got invited to ghostwrite a novel that had the part two, like the sequel to a novel that had been on the New York Times bestseller list and all. And I was tempted to do it. It was really good money, but I finally declined it because, not because I didn't need money. I terribly needed money, definitely. I declined it because it was an African-American protagonist, and I was worried two things: that I was going to spend too much time exploring the identity and not pushing the plot forward, or I think that the question to always ask when you're writing from another culture, say, is what is your motivation to do it? Would the story only work here or only work from that angle? And if so, that's great. I would be doing it for money, and I thought that's kind of a little mercenary. I don't think I'm going to do a good job, or I don't think I'm going to do a job I can be proud of anyways. I would definitely get the money, and that would be great. But at the end of your career, it's not all about money, I don't think. It's about whether you feel okay with what you've done.
I think writing is a really, really hard way to make money. Yeah. Sometimes when I'm really struggling, I think, why didn't I just become a flight attendant, or anything else that would get me out of just sitting here waiting for inspiration. But I think the other part of this has to do with readers too. I think good fiction kind of takes the readers, you're sitting in your living room or you're in bed with the light on, and all of a sudden, no, you're not there anymore. You're with the Arapahoes, and reading is such a wonderful, transforming experience. And I think I love movies and books on tape and all of that, but for me, there's something about looking at those words and all of a sudden, it's like I'm in a different time, I'm in a different place, I'm in somebody else's skin. And I know I've done a little bit of research on this. And for instance, if I'm reading, say, something about somebody climbing shiprock, the same sort of neurons would be activated in a person actually doing that climbing will be activated in me. It's like good reading, really, it's not only your brain, it's like your whole body that's transformed. So I think writers and readers have a very wonderful, intimate contract. And as a writer, I try to really take that seriously and not let anything go if I am not sure that it's the best I can do. And I have to say, getting back to what you were saying about how writing for money isn't all of it, I know sometimes my editors will be, I think, easier on my work than I am on my own work. And they'll say, oh yeah, this is fine. I think, no, it's not. I really do feel like there's that contract between the writer and the reader, and that I try to just put everything I can think of into every book and just figure when the next book comes up, maybe I'll get some other ideas. I don't know if that was even close to what your question was.
I think... No, absolutely. It's fascinating that you mentioned the contract, because it so happens that the Sanskrit word for literature is sahitya, and it's also in many modern Indian languages. And the word comes from sahit. Sahit means kind of like accompanying somebody. So it's a kind of act of company between the reader and the writer. So that's where the word comes from, and that contract absolutely makes sense. But the contract can take us to so many different places. I think that was also the subject of the travel panel that we heard, that it's going places where we are not transporting. And that's the fascinating thing about literature, that it actually creates empathy for the alien. It is not a kind of a binary between the sort of alien and the familiar, but it sort of makes the alien familiar in a strange way. But this is also an impossibly political question. That is, especially, and that I think has come up already in what many of you have mentioned, that when you write as somebody else, and I think the questions becomes trickier when that somebody else belongs to a social group that is marginal, that is sort of, and again, obviously writing as a dog, I can't somehow stop talking about that, writing as a dog, but that's sort of become, but even a dog, so either way. So and I wonder, and since I think all of you have mentioned in different ways, whether writing as an African American person or writing as the native reservation, this is something or the question of gender, and I wanted to ask you, how does the question of the political enter into the supernatural and speculative? Because in some ways it might seem like a kind of an apolitical zone. It's like, oh, it's just about things which didn't happen. But we all know that is never the case, because it's actually coming from very rooted real world, and the representation of the speculative is actually also political. So would you say a little bit about the element of the political in writing speculative work?
Yeah, no, definitely. As you say, we're all inherently political, whether we say we are or not. So I think every utterance or action we do is going to be politically charged. When I write from a political space that I'm not in myself, what I have to do is try to stay in that political space for the whole duration of the novel. I think that's why if I write a novel about somebody from from Chile, say, and I do all my research, and I talk to friends who are from there and everything, and I think I understand what it's like to be a Chilean. I think for 10 pages, I'll probably do great, but then on from page 10 to 15, I might slip and fall back to who I am, a guy from Texas, and that's going to result in an uneven novel. Somebody from Chile who reads it is going to say, I was with it, now I'm not with it. You know, it doesn't feel right anymore, and that's the danger. It's really hard. I think for brief instances, we can inhabit other political spaces. It's quite a feat to do it for the duration of a novel. I mean, people do it all the time, of course. I know when I write from a woman's point of view, I will have my wife or somebody read it, a woman read it, and I'll say, rake me over the coals because I know I did it wrong. You know, I know I did it wrong because I don't know what it's like to be a woman. This was a story that worked best from a woman's point of view, and sometimes I publish those, sometimes I don't because they just are too broken for me to rehabilitate. You know.
You still can't get the dog to read your fiction. I'm sorry. You know, we can as long as. I'd love to know what.
Well, I think that, again, the power of the writer's imagination really comes into play. But I think I write about a culture of which I am not. I think it takes a lot of immersion in that culture and with those people, a lot of research, a lot. You really have to live with them. You have to go and be with them and hear them and just talk to them about ordinary things and listen to the way they speak and what are the things they speak about and read everything you can and you just kind of, and then that fires your own imagination because you're connecting again on a human level. You're all, you know, you have that commonality always. But to look at the ways in which we are different, that takes a lot of imagination. And it's so rewarding and so wonderful. And for me, it's been so wonderful for when Arapahos tell me how much they like my books. And they say, oh gosh, did we do that? I didn't know that. And so they say they actually learned things from my books. I had a tribal councilman tell me that he thanked me for writing the books because he said he'd been trying to get his daughter interested in their history and their culture, and she just wasn't interested until she started reading my books. And then she came to him and she said, do we believe that? Do we really do that? Did we did that? And he told her she needed to go and sit down and talk with her grandmother, which she did. And she learned a lot about her own culture. But it was just from having picked up one of my books, and again, for me, it's the power of the imagination that allowed me to do that. To imagine what it would be like. And of course you draw on your own experiences. In writing my novels, I grew up here in the West. I'm a Western girl. And, you know, I rode ponies all over the prairie and did all those kinds of things when I was a kid. So I can connect. I can connect to the Arapaho kids who grew up that way, riding their ponies on the prairie. So there are fine ways in your own life that you can connect with people who are different from you.
I would agree with what you've said. And it's funny, when you asked that question, I was thinking, I write about the Navajo, and there are a lot of tremendous social issues that the Navajo people face. There is a huge problem with domestic violence. There's lots of alcoholism, meth, because the reservation has so many isolated places and so much poverty. There's a lot of meth, a lot of traffic accidents because of alcoholism and drinking, bootlegging, political corruption, on and on and on. But I figure I want my novels, like I said, to be truthful about the Navajo people, and so I do a lot of research. But also, I want them to be hopeful. I mean, my main characters are really good-hearted, bright, crime-solving people who are doing their best to not only to do their jobs as police officers, but also to make the world better. And so and really one of the joys of writing mystery is that you are charged with wrapping things up at the end. The crime, no matter what's happened, the crime has to be solved, and your detectives have to move on to solve another crime, to write another book. So I try to not ignore those kind of social problems, but to offer some hope that together we can come up with solutions. And the Navajo people have so many resources and so many friends in the larger world with economic resources and et cetera, that even though these bad things happen, we can get by it. And I have been criticized for writing books that are a little too PG instead of moving into the R or X-rated category. But I kind of think that's okay. I'm happy if some grandmother says to me, I loved your book and I gave it to my 13-year-old and he liked it too. I think really that's okay with me. I do a lot of talks for book clubs, and I had a call from the Toronto Men's Mystery Group. And we're talking, and then one guy says, well, you know, Ms. Hillerman, we read a lot of mysteries, and some of them are a little steamier than your books. And he said, you know, and by the way, your characters are married. I'm just thinking, so I have Bernadette Manuelito show up in a negligee, and half of my readers would have their big heart attack. It's like, no. Well, and the other thing about that is that within the Navajo culture, there is a different sense of modesty. You know, and I didn't get into that with those guys from Toronto, but I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. You guys might want something a little steamier, but you'll just have to read somebody else.
Toronto Men's Mystery Club. I mean, that really exists. I mean, that sounds, that sounds like the title of another mystery novel, right? In its own right.
I'll give you their email.
Begging to be written, But it's I think it's very interesting. I mean, I'm thinking of the white guy in Boulder. I mean, writing about and writing about the guy from Chile. And in a way, I think art is always about the person. It's in some ways, again, I think going back to the travel panel, I think one distinction was made that why is it not a brochure? And I think it's not a brochure because a travel work in the end is not really about the place. It's really about the traveler. It's really about the person. And art always reflects on the subjective and the personal. It kind of goes back. So the archive is kind of an excuse, really. It's really kind of this my story among the archive. And I was wondering if we could extend that, or it would be politically too risky to extend that in this situation. Like this white guy from Boulder writing about, Chile in the, 22nd century. And in the end, what do we expect it to be? Do we expect it to be about that supposed culture, or is it really a story of the narrator, really? And I think this is a question which all of you must grapple with, because at some point of time, all of you have written about cultures that are not yours. And that's a fascinating and very brave thing to do. And while you balance the demands of authenticity, is it also not okay for it to be really about something about yourself? I think that's interesting too. Or is it not okay? What do you think?
I think it's okay. I think you can't. Who I am is who I am, and there's no way around it. And so, I mean, I try to be the best storyteller I can be, and to be true to the characters I'm writing about, and not only native characters, but say bad guys. And one thing that was a real challenge for me was learning the whole culture of law enforcement. Because I got 3 traffic tickets, and that was about my only encounter with the police until I started writing these books. So I had to do all of that research. But yeah, I think in the end, I think in the end the best stories are universal stories. And there's stories about what Margaret was saying, love and loss and jealousy and bad decisions we make early in life that stick with us. And I don't think it doesn't matter what culture you are, those kind of universal things are with us all. And I think good fiction underlines those things.
Yeah, I think everything I've written is, to me, extremely autobiographical. I've only done fiction. I've never done nonfiction. Actually, I have 2. One of my novels is Growing Up Dead in Texas. It's about a guy named Stephen Graham Jones who he lives in a house I lived in and has parents that are really similar to my parents and everything. And also, I don't go home anymore because of that book. But then I have another novel called Demon Theory, which is about some kids in Indiana at a remote house with gargoyles plucking them up and doing bad stuff to them. And I consider that novel Demon Theory to be a lot more autobiographical than the Growing Up Dead in Texas novel, because I like to think that what novels are made of are emotions, and like I've never like killed anybody or been snatched from the sky by a gargoyle or anything like that, but the seed of that emotion is something I have experienced, and I magnify it on the page to make it into a story that's interesting to other people. And so for that reason, all of my novels, to me, being magnifications of things I have experienced, are really autobiographical, and I can't avoid that. I don't try to avoid that either. That's the only place I really have, that's all I have to write about, I think.
Boy, that is really an interesting question, because I do think as writers we are, in some ways we are writing about ourselves. We're transporting ourselves into other places and other times. I write a lot of history. I bring a lot of history into my novels. And that's a political aspect, because I'm just fascinated by all the crimes that occurred and the frauds and the injustices that were perpetrated against the Native peoples and against the Arapahoes. And I like to weave those kinds of things into my stories and allow them. I'm always interested in how do these old crimes percolate up into the present, and in what ways, sinister ways, and how do we deal with them. So that's a political aspect, I guess, of my books. But at the same time, I think I am writing about myself in a lot of ways. I'm writing about what's interesting to me. I'm not writing about what isn't interesting to me. I'm writing about what I think is important, and I'm writing about the values that I believe in and that I cling to, and that I find among my characters. That, interestingly enough, they have the same values. So I think it's a weird mixture. You know, you're writing about other people, but we're also writing about ourselves.
You don't want to create characters you feel guilty about letting out in the world, or maybe you do. I think we are getting to the point where we should open up the question to the audience. I just want to conclude with one last question. Both Anne and Margaret come from this fascinating background of writing non-fiction and journalism to writing speculative fiction. And that seems to me like a really big leap. You go from the real to the hyper-real. You just sort of, you abandon a space in between. And I wanted to sort of quickly get a sense of how does that happen? How does you go from being the ethnographic or the real or the journalistic to just boom, you left all that behind? So,
well, let me tell you, it wasn't just boom. It's we're just talking about different crafts. I think if you're a writer, which Anne and I, we were nonfiction writers. We wrote for newspapers and magazines. We wrote nonfiction books. You're just used to sitting down and pushing the words out and making those deadlines. You do it. You are a writer. You're a professional writer. And you're not, I have never in my life had writer's block. I don't know what that is. I'm used to sitting down and creating something. So there were good things that I learned from my nonfiction work that I was able to bring to my fiction. But also, it is a different craft. It's really a different craft. And this is how I always look at it. In nonfiction, you can tell. You can say, she was angry. And that's a perfectly good sentence, and we all know what it means. In fiction, you have to show. Fiction is very visual. So the character gets up out of her chair and stomps down the aisle, and her heels clack into the silence. We have to see that anger. And to this day, and I've written 22 novels, to this day, I'll write something and I'll look at it and I'll go, boy, is that boring. And then when I think about it, why is that boring? Because I'm saying she's angry and I'm not showing you that anger. So that to me was the biggest thing.
And I agree with you. And another thing that I really learned from nonfiction was respect for editors. I think when you're writing nonfiction, it's very collaborative. I mean, you send it in, you have people who do the fact checking, people who say you have 3,000 more words than you need, all of that. And I realized that I didn't agree with everything, but a lot of it really was beneficial. And I think it made me realize that every word I wrote was not precious. That some of them could go, and actually the story would be better. So that was one thing that I learned from nonfiction. And like you're saying, the discipline. The last nonfiction book I wrote was really a wonderful transition to fiction, although I had no idea that I was going to be writing fiction. my dad would frequently get letters or comments from people saying, gee, I didn't ever know anything about the Southwest, and when I read your descriptions, then I thought, oh, I'll go to the Grand Canyon, and then I bought a house in Flagstaff, and then I retired and moved to Arizona. So I thought it would be nice for people to actually see photographs of the places Dad wrote about. So my husband and he did the photos, I did some nonfiction text, and I pulled out quotes from some of the 18 books that Dad had written where he's doing the wonderful descriptions. So that was my last nonfiction book, and to write that book, I had to reread all of those, love to, reread all of those novels for those wonderful descriptions. So then when Dad died, all those stories and those characters and those settings were really fresh in my mind, and his voice was still fresh in my mind. And I think that, although I wouldn't have expected it, was kind of an easier bridge from nonfiction to moving on to fiction.
You know, to cut in right quick, I'm sorry. I agree with Margaret about writer's block being not real or something. Somebody told, or I read this somewhere once, that all writer's block is you setting your standards too high, you know? And if I'm thinking about the critics in New York reading my book, then I'm never going to be able to write well enough. I'm going to fail with every word, and I'm going to start over and start over and start over. But if I think I'm writing for my cousin who laughs at everything I say, then I can get a lot of words down, you know?
Well, I can tell from the faces in the audience that there are questions. And so it's a time we maybe invite a few questions. Say, over there, yes.
I'm curious how you would advise a memoirist to relate to themselves as character, how to interrogate the otherness of their experience. For the, I like you, it's recognizable, then that jarring thing that gives tension once they're already sucked into the like. Does that make sense what you were saying, Anne? That then there's that thing. But other than, you know, the memoir is telling just the naked truth, you know, where the complexity of us is just in telling the truth, it's there. But I'm curious if you have other insights around a memoirist might relate to themselves as character.
Well, I would think one tricky thing about memoir is to realize that you don't have to include every detail. You know, to really be hard on your own story and kind of be your own editor and say, well, yeah, you know, there were those 3 years when I was in nursing school and I had that boring roommate and she always played the radio too loud. It's like, nobody cares about that. You know, really to kind of be really sort of ruthless with your own story and, you know, just get to the end. I think the other part of that is deciding, all of us have so many stories, deciding which of your stories is it that you really want to tell. And you might not even, none of us might even realize what that story is until we've written a lot of words and thought about it a long time. And I think the other thing is to just be persistent. And like Stephen was saying, not to be too hard on yourself, not to imagine that New York editor, but imagine your cousin who laughs at your jokes as the reader, so you can keep going even when you think this may not be in the final book. I know for me, something about the energy of putting words down and getting the story told then gives me more energy and gives me more insights. Whereas if I'm too self-critical, it's a real roadblock. And I think for memoir that would even be more true because you don't have quite so many other sources to draw on.
I think you need to separate out. You've got two parts of your brain, your right side and your left side. And I can never remember which is which. One's the creative side and one is the editor side. And you need to separate those two. And when you're actually writing, you stay in your creative side and you do not let the editor interfere. You do not stop and go to the dictionary and look up words. You do not. There are many times when I'm writing and I come to something I can't get the exact word that I want. I put in X's and I keep going, and I don't let that creative energy lag. And then when I get it all done, I think, wow, this is really bad. And I'm thinking, boy, that New York critic is going to kill this. But you know what? I've got it written. I've got a piece of work. And then I go back and I go into my editor's side of my brain And I start working on it, and I fix it, and I fix all those words and those sentences. It's like Hemingway said one time, he was being interviewed, and the interviewer asked him about some book he was written. He said, yeah. Hemingway said, I rewrote it 33 times. And the interviewer said, well, what was wrong? What was it, 33 times? What was the matter? And he said, what were you trying to do? And Hemingway said, get the words right. So that's what the editor does, but don't let that editor into the creator's part.
Yeah, I think you write your first draft with your heart, and then you revise with your brain, I think. That's what I try to do. But I think my advice is probably the advice a fiction writer would give, which is make a lot of stuff up to make it interesting, you know?
It's like once... James Joyce once supposed to have said that I worked all day today, I worked a lot. And somebody asked him, did you write a lot? He said, 2 sentences. So I think this gentleman there had a question.
Yeah, I enjoyed your discussion very much. Thank you. I have not read many mystery novels. My interest has been more on social novels. But I'm curious about one thing, that when you write a mystery plot, then obviously you know who done it, because you are going to write it. Then as a writer, you drop hints. And I feel quite often the writer cheats me by dropping a wrong hint and pointing me out to the wrong person. So initially, for example, in Agatha Christie's books, I discovered the perfect formula. I knew who done it because the most unlikely character would have done it. So is that something like that you also do? Do you drop wrong hints and...
Yeah, you have to have red herrings, or else the reader's going to figure it out too quick. You know, the trick is, can you disguise your red herrings enough where the reader doesn't feel cheated? I think, and that's a trick, definitely. It's a really hard trick. Maybe somebody else knows how to do it.
Well, the good thing about mysteries is that you know that you have to solve the crime at the end, and so I mean that's when I start. I usually have an idea of, I know who the bad guy is, and I know what the crime is, but I probably don't know all of the points in the middle. And as I'm writing, those things kind of come true to me. And so then, just like you're saying, I have to go back and kind of plant some clues and plant some wrong clues, just so there'll be a little more tension with the reader. In the book that I just finished, there was something wrong with it, and I just couldn't, my editor liked it, but I knew there was something wrong with it. And I finally figured out it didn't have enough, there wasn't enough crime in it. So I had to like figure out, there had to be somebody else who died, and then, you know, the whole, and it was tough putting all of that stuff in, but it was fun too. And I know there are writers, very efficient writers who do outlines, and they can like go from A to, just like you're saying, A to B, and they know where all the breadcrumbs go. But I just have the loaf of bread with me at the end, and then I have to go back.
No wonder the Toronto Men's Mystery Club felt cheated.
Did your father write like this? Made your own plan before?
Yeah, I think it's a genetic problem.
I had a question. Not quite sure how to phrase this, and hopefully it will be understandable. So Anne and Margaret, well, forgive me if I'm wrong, but perhaps you're not Native American and you write in the Native American culture as Anne's dad did, and Stephen is Native American and maybe for the most part does not write in the Native American culture and writes in some fantasy culture to a large extent, and yet you all have recognizable voices, and your dad had such a recognizable voice, whether he was writing his mysteries or his own memoir. And it feels like the voice is trying to say something, because your dad's voice was the same voice. And so I'm wondering, and here you are, you're writing mysteries, but it's in the Native American culture, and that's so rich and so deep, and there's something there for you that you're immersed in, and as Margaret said, obsessed with. And I'm just wondering, for each of you, do you have some sense of what it is your voice wants to say? Does that question make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
No, not really. That's why I write, to try to figure it out, you know? I think, because I really don't have any idea. You know, the idea about outlining and not outlining, you know? I've done it different ways. I've done it so many different ways, and I keep thinking I'm going to figure out how to do this, and every single time I start a new novel, I'm like, well, this is totally different, you know? And so then I have to try to find what I'm trying to say as I'm saying it, always. And I fear that if I did know what I was trying to say, that I wouldn't even bother to say anything because I've already got it figured out, you know? Like, sometimes people ask me a question, and I won't have an answer, and I'll say, give me 20 minutes, I'm going to go write and figure out what's in my head. Because that's how I figure out what's in my head, is I write, you know? No, when I look back, I don't look back on it. People ask me questions about books I've written, and I nod and smile, but I don't remember them, you know?
I think we writers write about what interests us. And why do these things interest us? Why'd you get interested in werewolves, Stephen? I mean, we just all have these stories and these ideas that drop into our head. We don't know where they come from, you know? But we have to go with them. And our hope always is, well, if this interests me, then I hope I can write it well enough that it's going to interest you. So I hope I can communicate. I mean, I guess we're a really egotistical lot that we want to communicate our interests to the world, you know, but that's what we do.
And I think sometimes as we're writing, and I bet this is true for you, you realize all of a sudden something that you didn't know that is fascinating. Like when I was working on Rock with Wings, I realized I needed to figure out, well, first of all, with Spider-Woman's Daughter, I had to set something on fire. And the Rock with Wings, something blows up. Song of the Lion, another car blows up. I think, gee, I could have been a pyromaniac. It's like, I'm so fascinated by how you can make things blow up and set them on fire and have it be like, so nobody really suspects it. So maybe in my next life, huh?
You know, I had that same thing happen. I was doing a book event down in Austin, and it got to the question and answer period, and a woman in the back raised her hand, and she said, what about the vomiting in your novel? And so I tried to come up with some answer that made sense, and I pretended like I remembered that had happened and everything. And then I answered a couple more questions, and she raised her hand again. I thought, wow, she's a really close reader. And she said, what about all the throwing up? And I was like, and she kept asking it with different words until the staff finally had to remove her. But the result of that was, number one, it told me I must be fascinated with vomiting, you know? But number two, now every time I'm writing and a character starts to like dry heave, like her hand goes up in the back of my head, you know?
Oh, the police profile of novelists must be a fascinating one, you know, if there is one going on. Do we have time for maybe one more question? Yeah, over there.
So much of editing is telling yourself you really screwed that up. Have you found a way to make it less of a masochistic process?
So masochistic. I don't know if it's a masochistic project to edit, because when I finish writing, and as I said, I don't edit while I write, so when I finish, I've got a whole novel, and I know it's not a very good novel, but I know it's going to be good. I know it's going to be good after I do the work. I mean, it's going to be, maybe it's not going to be good. I should take that back. Maybe the critics are not going to say it's good, but I know it's going to be as good as I think I can do at that moment, and so I'm always looking at it with, I want this to be the best piece of work that I can do. So it's not masochistic, it's actually quite fun. I really love it. I love getting into, you know, the first draft and really working with it and making it all come together. And part of the secret is to cut out about half of it. That's, you know, the real part of it, and then you work with the rest of it. So I think it's fun. It really is fun.
I agree, and also if you can get past that bubble of like happiness, like when you finish a project, you're like, that's perfect, it's golden, it's timeless. If you can go like 4 weeks and wait till that fades, you know, and then go back to it, you can be mean.
Well, I think it's time to go back to the realm of the real. We've wonderfully proved the thesis that writers are all delightfully screwed up people and they tell more about themselves than they want today. So thank you very much for being with us and being so involved. And thank you all the panelists for giving us all your trade secrets.